Welcome to the Heal from Your Narcissist podcast, your go-to guide for everything you need to know about narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic abuse. Get ready to dive into understanding what drives narcissistic behavior and to learn clinically proven techniques for healing from the effects of narcissistic abuse with your host, best-selling author, and registered psychotherapist, Heather Kent.
Welcome back, everybody. I am super excited to have you here for our third episode of the Heal from Your Narcissist pop-up podcast. And we are moving right along today on our healing journey from narcissistic abuse, now that we have an understanding of the narcissistic cycle of abuse that we talked about in the last episode. So now we are very clear on identifying the signs of narcissistic abuse. And we also understand that it was the trauma bond that developed to our narcissist that is what kept us stuck in this cycle. And it's what kept us feeling compelled to return to the relationship and made it very difficult to leave or end the relationship. And most importantly, we now understand that it was not our fault. Remember that we were that lobster sitting in the cold water at the beginning of it all. So today, we're going to take a closer look at the impact that narcissistic abuse has had on your brain. And this is actually really cool information. And it's really, really important to understand this. And so we're going to take a look at different parts of our brain and different areas of our brain to understand this better. So 3 of the main areas of our brain that has been affected by trauma include the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. So prolonged exposure to trauma or abuse can actually lead to physiological alterations in these key neural systems that are involved in the brain's stress response. And so the hippocampus and the amygdala are parts of what we call the limbic system or the limbic brain. And they are key areas of the brain that are involved in memory, emotion, and arousal. And so the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that's located right behind or right in front of our forehead, in the middle of our forehead, like right above our eyes. And so that part of our brain is actually the sort of planning and organization and cognitive center of our brain. And this helps to integrate all of the information and decide, make logical conclusions based on the information that we have. And so these are 3 of the main areas that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to look at how the exposure to the trauma has impacted these parts of our brain. So the really interesting, fascinating thing is that the hippocampus, which is part of our limbic brain, and that's kind of the more primal lower part of our brain that's sort of located at the lower back part of our skull, like close to our brainstem. And so the hippocampus, this part of our brain, is responsible for memory and for differentiating between past and present and putting events into chronological order. And so this part of our brain works to remember and make sense of the trauma that we've experienced. Now, what happens, though, is that after a long period of time and with consistent exposure to trauma, this part of our brain actually physically shrinks, okay? It gets smaller. And so there are so many people that I work with who complain and talk about how they have a terrible memory and they don't understand what happened because they used to have a really good memory. And I also suffered from this problem. But yeah, this is what happens because as a result of exposure to the ongoing narcissistic abuse that we sustained over time, the memory and organization and chronological order part of our brain has actually gotten smaller. And so it's no wonder that people who are survivors of trauma experience these poor memory problems. Now, I want to talk about the amygdala. So amygdala is another part of that limbic system, the limbic part of our brain, the lower part right by our brainstem. And this is like our very primal alarm system. This part is wired to keep us alive. It is wired for survival. And when it is activated, it makes it very difficult to think rationally because this part of our brain is sending off alarm systems that we are in danger. So this is the alarm system. It's like pulling the fire alarm, danger, danger, danger. And the response that our brain gives off from that alarm is that fight, flight, or freeze that we talk about a lot. And so when our amygdala is activated, we can't think of anything else other than to fight the threat, run away from it, or when we can't do either of those things, we freeze and kind of become paralyzed. Okay. And so when the amygdala is activated, it is very difficult, and I would argue almost impossible, to think rationally and to be able to access the prefrontal cortex, which is that thinking, logic, cognitive, understanding, analysis part of our brain. And this is what happens as a result of prolonged exposure to trauma. The prefrontal cortex, which regulates everything, makes it very difficult to access because the hyperactive and overactive amygdala is firing off the alarm system all the time. And so what actually happens when we talk about, going into survival mode, what actually happens in our brain when we're in survival mode is that the limbic system, that lower brain function, that primal survival part of our brain, that takes over. And so the amygdala is firing off danger, danger, danger. And our hippocampus is completely unable to make sense of what's happening and organize information and store memory, while our learning and thinking and logic brain, which is the prefrontal cortex at the front of our forehead, that logical smart part of our brain is kind of temporarily offline. We can't access it. And so this explains why it's normal that we have a hard time as a result of being exposed to prolonged abusive behavior. We have a hard time with planning and memory and emotion regulation. Our brain has literally been impaired by the stress of the trauma that we've experienced. And the connection between that logical, rational part of our brain and the emotional, kind of impulsive part of our brain has been broken. And so our limbic system is what takes the trauma in immediately. And that's the part that sets off, like I've talked about, that brain's alarm system. And so our amygdala is also what processes our initial emotions. And it tends to become hyperactive, meaning it gets tripped very easily when we are traumatized. I was just snapping there. And while our prefrontal cortex and our hippocampus, which deals with, like I said, the learning, the memory, decision-making, analysis, those parts get dampened when exposed to trauma. And so the really kind of inconvenient thing is that our traumatic memories stay stuck in the brain's nonverbal regions, like the amygdala, like the thalamus, like the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. And this is all located very close to our brainstem. And these parts are not accessible to our frontal lobes, which is, like I said, that kind of mission control center for reasoning and logic. And those parts help us to pay attention, help us to manage time, switch focus, help us to plan and organize, remember details, and perform tasks based on experience. And this part of our brain is essentially non-functioning. And so is it any wonder then that we show up at the end of all of this, at the end of the relationship, feeling like I can't remember things, I can't keep track of things, it feels like I can't do anything effectively. And so this is because your brain has actually chemically and physiologically been altered as a result of having gone through narcissistic abuse and having this prolonged exposure to trauma. And so these key aspects, so we already talked about the amygdala and we already talked about the hippocampus. There's two more aspects of our limbic brain that I want to talk about, and those are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, so when exposed to trauma, when we've been dealing with and going through prolonged and repeated abuse, the thalamus actually stops working and it gets disconnected. And this makes it very difficult to integrate and process any sensory experience. So some people talk a lot about like feeling kind of numb and like a numbing feeling. And this is because the thalamus kind of shuts down. And so trauma is often not able to be remembered as a cohesive story, but as kind of these broken, isolated fragments of sensory experience. So there might be like flashes of images or flashes of sounds or maybe body sensations, but it's not remembered or stored as this unified, cohesive story because the thalamus is not able to work properly. Okay, now we have already talked about the amygdala becoming super hyperactive, and it's the main way that we relate to the world, and that we get really startled and we get very jumpy. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit because I want to talk to you about something that I like to call the danger meter, and our amygdala plays a key role in activating our danger meter. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So we're really startled. We become, hyper vigilant and really like edgy, and we feel very jumpy, and we're very, easily activated by small things that are happening around us. Our amygdala is also not able to decide properly whether there actually is a threat or not. It just thinks that everything is a threat. And so we have a higher risk of misrepresenting whether a situation actually is dangerous. And when that in normal, remember we activate that kind of fight, flight, freeze response. But when that normal escape response is blocked for whatever reason, like we can't get out of the situation that we're in because, we're stuck in this relationship that's abusive. So when we can't run, the amygdala keeps sending the signals even after the event has passed because we haven't been able to escape from the situation. And so now the other part that we haven't talked about yet is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the part of our brain that releases stress hormones and other hormones. And so what happens with the hypothalamus is that once our limbic system and that alarm system has been activated, the hypothalamus keeps releasing and firing off stress hormones like cortisol and all kinds of other nasty things that are coursing through our body at this very, adrenaline, all those things. And so the stress hormones actually take so much longer to come back to baseline levels. And the hypothalamus just keeps firing them off once the amygdala has been activated. The danger, that alarm system. And again, we've got the hippocampus, which has been, shrunk over time. And so it's incapable of forming our memories into this cohesive chronological order. We've got hyperarousal, we've got numbing, and everything just feels like a big mess. And so this is what is actually going on inside of our brains. And our traumatic memories get stuck in the limbic regions of the brain. And that causes, like I said before, that reasoning part, that prefrontal cortex, in the frontal lobes of our brain, right by our forehead, they go offline when they're activated. And so, what is the result of all of this? What do you think? And it's an answer that a lot of people are surprised by, actually. And the results of these physiological and chemical changes that go on in our brain as a result of repeated exposure to abuse is developing complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. Now, I just want to take a second to kind of let you absorb that, because I do have many clients who I work with, again, highly successful, very competent, educated, intelligent, and we don't often realize that once we've gone through something like this, what we're experiencing and the symptoms that we're feeling and the behaviors that we are exhibiting are actually symptoms of complex PTSD. And so many of us don't even realize that we have PTSD as a result of our abusive relationship with a narcissist. And so I want to explain this to you. So you might be asking, well, what's the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD? And I thought that only war veterans got PTSD. That is absolutely not accurate. So people can develop PTSD after any kind of exposure or experience of a traumatic event. Now, it's not guaranteed that everyone who experiences trauma is going to go on to develop PTSD, but I can tell you that prolonged exposure to abuse almost always leads to the development of symptoms of some kind of PTSD. And it's actually something that most people don't realize and don't understand, that that's what's happening. So the difference between regular PTSD, if you can call it that, or complex PTSD is that complex PTSD develops from a chronic trauma. So that means a trauma that is recurring over a long term, and one that is often inescapable, such as being in an abusive relationship with a narcissist. In addition to the regular symptoms of PTSD, which the majority of CPTSD victims also meet the diagnostic criteria for, survivors of trauma who have complex PTSD find that their ability to adapt to stress, interact with others, and regulate their emotions are severely affected. So chronic trauma can cause painful events that are seemingly minor to other people to actually feel and appear as though they're life-threatening. So what are the symptoms of complex PTSD? I'm going to run through a little bit of a list, and then I'm going to talk about a few of them in a bit more detail. So symptoms of complex PTSD include avoiding thinking of their traumatic events, avoiding talking about it, being easily frightened, easily startled, like that hypervigilance and that jumpiness and edginess, experiencing negative mood, experiencing lots of negative thinking, feeling always on guard and ready to jump if something bad's going to happen, avoiding certain places, avoiding activities, avoiding situations and people that remind you of the traumatic experience. Flashbacks, and I'll talk about those in more detail in a moment. Having difficulty concentrating, unusual aggressive behavior, loss of interest in activities that you used to enjoy. And here's a really big one: feeling and carrying guilt or shame about what happened or about being in a relationship like this. I know I certainly carried that. I'm a strong, competent, independent woman. I'm an educated person. How could I let this happen? That was something I said to myself over and over and over. And I had so much guilt and shame over it. And I felt embarrassed. Sometimes we turn to substance abuse. Sometimes we have difficulty sleeping, or we have bad dreams or nightmares. So I just want to dive into a few of these symptoms in a bit more detail to help us to really understand, what that feels like. So difficulty concentrating, like I've said, is a really common one, and it has to do with the memory problems and the shrinking hippocampus that can't integrate things properly or make sense of what's going on. And so due to the traumatic impact of what we've been through, survivors of trauma often experience these lapses in ability to perform tasks that they used to be able to do really easily beforehand. And this can feel very confusing and scary if you don't understand why this is happening. Like, I used to be able to make this complex meal, off by heart. I used to be able to just throw it together in my head. And now I can't remember, what I need. I have to look it up. Like, I don't understand what's going on. What's wrong with me? And it's because your hippocampus has changed. Now, the good news is it's not permanent and it can recover and go back. And so, but, initially it feels like really unnerving and really scary if we don't understand what's happening. So I want to also differentiate the difference between flashbacks and memories. So a flashback is something that happens when it actually feels as though you are back in that situation and you are reliving in every detail the experience over again. So when survivors of trauma encounter some kind of stimulus that reminds us of the trauma, regardless of how many years have passed, the amygdala, that alarm system, reacts as if we are re-experiencing that same event all over again. And then the hypothalamus releases stress hormones and the body goes into that fight or flight mode. We also call this the amygdala hijack. The amygdala hijacks the brain and everything's like danger, danger. And so the danger of the trauma can be reactivated by an event that is seemingly harmless to an outside person, which can result in these overwhelming physical sensations, as well as impulsive and sometimes aggressive behavior. And this is all in response to the distress that we are experiencing and reliving all over again. And so the traumatic flashbacks reduce our prefrontal cortex's ability to remind us, hey, this is just something that reminds us of this. This is not actually happening again. Everything's okay. You're safe. Your prefrontal cortex is not available. And so it makes it very difficult for us to distinguish a false threat from a real threat. So a flashback is an experience we have when we get triggered by a reminder of what happened, and it feels as though we are reliving it again, versus a memory where we are just, something reminds us of what happened, we have a trigger, and we remember an event, but we are aware that we're not actually going through it again. So when we recall these traumatic memories, the logical thinking brain, again, is no longer in conversation with the tangible memories of our trauma. And so it's no wonder then that both our bodies and our brains start to freak out over these emotional and visual flashbacks, because we're not able to integrate these two parts of ourselves when we're dealing with reminders of the trauma. And so, and this is caused by this, we can't integrate this. So this lack of integration feeds into the larger phenomenon that we call dissociation. And dissociation is actually pretty cool because it's our body and brain's defense mechanism that protects us from the trauma. So some people actually kind of report feeling disconnected. They feel like a total numbness, or they feel like they're not connected to their body, or like they're watching something happening to themselves. And those are signs of experiencing dissociation. And this is actually a really clever defense mechanism that the brain does to protect us from the pain. And that happens pretty often. And so dissociation can take place even without a traumatic event. So have you ever had an experience? Think about a time when you lost track of time because you were doing a task. You were, involved in folding the laundry or doing the dishes, or maybe you just kind of zone out. A lot of people experience a type of dissociation when we're driving. We're driving on highway, there's not a lot of traffic, it's straight road, and we just kind of like zone out for a bit. And then all of a sudden we realize, oh, we're at the exit. Like, I don't even recall the last 20 minutes. We call that highway hypnosis. And that's actually and almost everyone experiences that. And that's a form of dissociation where we just kind of like check out and lose track and aren't really aware of what's going on. So we all experience mild forms of dissociation, but in a major traumatic situation, the brain can split the information from the trauma to make it easier to digest. And so it breaks it up into these fragmented pieces again, which makes it harder to like form this cohesive story, but it's doing that to make it easier to digest. And so it's trying to help protect us from the like gross impact of what we've been through. So what happens when we experience dissociation is that we feel disconnected from our memories, sometimes from our identity, and from our emotions. And it breaks the trauma down into these smaller, more digestible parts so that different aspects of the trauma get stored in these different compartments in our brain. So it's like our experiences of trauma over time get broken down, and they each get put into a separate drawer or a separate box and compartmentalized like this in our brain. But what happens, so I have this stack of storage bins of our traumatic memories. But what happens as a result of this is that the information gets disorganized. And so we're not able to make sense of it all or integrate it into this coherent narrative so that we can fully process what happened. We often can also fall into a pattern of thinking that we call black and white or all or nothing thinking. And this is a cognitive distortion or thought trap or unhelpful thinking style in which everything is categorized as either all good or all bad. So survivors of abuse are prone to seeing themselves in this black and white thinking, judging themselves as worthless and useless and terrible. Like we're all bad because we've been conditioned to believe that as a result of the abuse and the gaslighting, the triangulation and the blaming and the deflecting and the projecting that we sustained from our narcissist. Sometimes we may engage in self-harming behaviors to try and cope with the overwhelming emotions. And we carry lots of guilt and shame around this as well, if that's something that we do engage in. And survivors, self-harm can look like, maybe doing some cutting, or it could be, excessive drinking, excessive drug use, placing ourselves in dangerous situations, self-sabotaging, things that are actually positive for ourselves. And so this is also very common. And there is no shame in it because we're just doing what we can to try and manage the overwhelm of the emotions that we're experiencing as a result of what we've been through. Sometimes people may even have suicidal thoughts and feel as if they can no longer cope with the pain, and this is a big sign that it's time to go to seek professional help, like ASAP. But we feel this way because we have this like overwhelming sense of helplessness and like a paralysis. And it feels like there's no way out from the pain that we're experiencing. And so, as you can see, complex PTSD is life-changing. It can be life-changing, and it can be severe, and it can have, but not always, but it can have some life-threatening symptoms that are very important to deal with right away. And even if we don't have those life-threatening symptoms, it creates this very negative self-concept. And it severely affects our ability to regulate our emotions and feel in control of our emotions. And it causes this sort of fragmented sense of ourselves and, those experiences of dissociative symptoms. And it can be very isolating. Complex PTSD can be very isolating because it causes this deep fear of trusting others. And we can maintain a sense of normalcy, outwardly and in public and in our professional lives, because we don't really have to have close, intimate, personal relationships with people in our professional life, right? And so that feels a lot easier and a lot safer because we keep it business only. But when it comes to personal relationships, there is this very deep fear of trusting others, and it feels like we're very alone, and there might be this feeling of abandonment. And so it really comes as no surprise that being in a relationship with a narcissist, or having multiple relationships with narcissists over your lifetime, or being raised by a narcissistic parent may cause complex PTSD. And so you may be experiencing some of these symptoms. Maybe you experienced a lot of them, when the relationship was first over, and maybe some of them had dissipated over time, which is pretty common, which is also very positive. But you may still have a few lingering symptoms that, are bothering you and are making it disruptive for you. And so remember that all of this is happening because our trauma brain, our brain, this picture that I've talked about is what our brain on trauma looks like. And, because of what we've been through, we have a much more hyperactive and much more sensitive danger meter. So remember, I said I was going to talk about that. So the danger meter is very closely connected to our amygdala. And so every human being on the planet has a danger meter. And it is sort of hardwired for survival. And that's why we have it. So because being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. And we are by nature social creatures. Some people are more introverted and like to spend time alone, and that's great. But by nature, we are a social species. And so safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. And this is research. This is well documented. And so going through prolonged emotional abuse actually teaches our brains to believe that people cannot be trusted, that they will betray us, and that we are not safe unless we are alone. And so in order for our body and our brain and our nervous system to calm down, heal, and to grow, we need to have this visceral feeling of safety. And so what can happen is that trauma can turn the whole world into a gathering of perceived threats. And so we now, as a result of having been through these traumatic experiences, have a more hyperactive danger meter. And the danger meter activates our alarm system, i.e. the amygdala, much more frequently. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this as well. So this is what we are dealing with on a regular basis as a result of having been through narcissistic abuse with a narcissist in our lives. And so what I'm hoping is that this is helping you to understand why you are experiencing the things you are experiencing, why you have these strange negative thoughts, why you have these overwhelming impulsive emotions. And it all is because you were able to survive long-standing exposure to abuse. And this is actually quite amazing, because although it's had a pretty significant impact, you were able to survive it. And this demonstrates our amazing resilience. And I know it doesn't feel like resilience when we have all of these negative side effects and symptoms of PTSD, but the fact that we got through it is really quite amazing. And so we're going to talk more about what we can do about these symptoms in our next episode. So I know this is a lot of information that I threw at you today in a short period of time. And I'm guessing that some of what I've talked about today sounds very familiar to you, or that you may be experiencing at least some of these symptoms, and it might feel really overwhelming. And it might feel like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I do about this? So I want you to know that I'm here to help you, and I would be happy to connect with you and to talk to you. So if you would like to book a consultation call with me, head on over to my website, heatherjkent.com, and click on the link at the top of the page to book in a call with me. And I would be very happy to connect with you to help you work through some of these symptoms, to help answer your questions, and to help you to understand more about what you can do to move past these symptoms. And we're going to talk about some strategies in our next episode. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will talk to you soon.
This has been another episode of Heal from Your Narcissist, where we help survivors of narcissistic abuse make sense of their experience and share clinical tools for healing. If you like today's show, be sure to share with a friend and leave a review on whichever platform you are listening from. And don't forget to connect with Heather directly at www.heatherjkent.com, where you can send her a message, follow her on social media, or book a one-on-one call to continue on your healing journey.